This video was made with support from my patrons, whose names are on screen now. If you want to, you can join them today and even get access to exclusive content. The link to my Patreon is in the description, so check it out if you're interested. Anyway, on with the show. By the time you're watching this video, the latest entry in the Forza Motorsport series would have already been released. Of course, a lot has been made about the game before it even came out. I'm talking about its single player, handling model, and various other features. But if you followed the discourse around the game, there will be one topic that you're probably quite familiar with by now: the car models. The Forza Motorsport reboot launched with over 500 cars, down on the more than 700 that its predecessor launched with, but still a very respectable number. But the sheer quantity of these cars is not the issue, it's the quality. Something that became very apparent in the Circuit de Catalunya reveal trailer as a very tired-looking Mitsubishi Evo 6 trundled around the track. But let's not pretend that these awkward-looking models are something new to Forza. You just need to take a look at Forza Horizon 5 to see the evidence. Many cars have outdated and inaccurate models. The Nissan Silvia S15 is a very obvious example, with its stubby front bumper and its downward-sloping rear end when compared to the real thing. In fact, many of these car models originate from Forza Motorsport 2 from 2007. Some even claim that they date back to the original Forza Motorsport on the original Xbox. From the outside, it is a bizarre and outrageous situation, but for a longtime fan of Gran Turismo, such as myself, it leaves you with some interesting memories. The PlayStation 3 era of Gran Turismo was very strange in retrospect. It promised a lot and delivered some of it, I guess. But one of the things that was unique to these games was having two clearly defined tiers of cars modeled to different levels of quality. But why? And how could Polyphony, a developer that is so fixated on the details of accuracy and consistency, let this happen? To answer all of this and more, we need to head back to the start of the PS3 era, 2006. Gran Turismo HD concept marked the beginning of Polyphony's foray into the newly released PlayStation 3, being available in North America and Japan by digital download in December 2006, and PAL regions in March 2007. It featured only 10 cars and a single track, but boasted much higher fidelity models given the increased power of the hardware, as well as a full cockpit view for the first time in the series. As it turned out, the full version of Gran Turismo HD was never made, with the team deciding to focus their efforts on Gran Turismo 5 instead. The first culmination of this was in Gran Turismo 5 Prologue, which was initially released in December 2007 as a sort of demo to the full Gran Turismo 5. In reality, GT5 Prologue is pretty much its own bite-sized Gran Turismo game, rather than being a small section of what GT5 itself would be. The initial version of the game only featured 37 cars, but over time this would increase to more than 70 models, again all rendered in impressive detail. And for a while, this was all players had to bide their time with whilst waiting for the full Gran Turismo 5 to launch. What was once a slated 2009 release ended up being a late 2010 debut. But in the interim, there was plenty of news and speculation to dive into. In August 2009, a page detailing the available features in GT5 was put up on the Gran Turismo website. Of the notes included, it was stated that there would be 1,000 vehicles in the game, 170 being new premium models featuring modelled interiors and vehicle damage, and the other 830 being standard models, some of which being carried over from GT4. This page was quickly removed, but the point had been made. This is the first ever mention of standard and premium cars in relation to GT5, but at this point, the meaning of those wasn't entirely clear. Specifying full interior models for just the premium cars implied that the 830 standard cars wouldn't have modelled interiors, and as you can imagine, many people were not impressed by this. But mentioning that some of the standard models were cars being carried over from GT4 could have been interpreted in two ways. One was that it just meant they were cars we had already seen in GT4, as opposed to new to the franchise cars. And the other interpretation was that these standard models were literally ports of the PS2 car models from GT4. and initially this distinction wasn't made clear. To further confuse things, we need to talk about damage. Fully modelled cosmetic damage was another feature touted for GT5, but only for the premium cars. Sort of. You see, when damage had been previewed in gameplay and pre-rendered trailers, they almost always used the 2008 WRC cars to demonstrate this. In these cases, you could see parts detach, like the doors and hood, as well as bodywork deformation, but that seemed to just be limited to the race and rally cars. More footage and screenshots started emerging of road cars with fully modelled interiors, such as the Ferrari 458 Italia, showing a much more scaled back damage model. And then came a bombshell, courtesy of the February 2010 edition of the official PlayStation magazine, stating that all 1,000 cars would have modelled interiors after all. However, it did make the distinction that the 180 premium cars would have interior damage modelling. So it now appeared that the main distinction between a standard and a premium car was simply the level of damage. But then, in April 2010, an interview with series producer Kazunori Yamauchi emerged, in which he stated, "Standard models won't have an interior view, less detailing, and no crash model." What now? Was the reaction of most people reading that. Until this point, many people, including many outlets like GT Planet, had reached the conclusion that standard referred to the reduced level of damage and was separate from the distinction between cars with or without an interior. This would explain the discrepancy between the WRC cars with their detachable parts and normal road cars with just scratches and dents. But now, a standard car meant a lower detailed car without an interior view and with reduced damage. But then, what did that make cars like the 458 Italia, which did have a modelled interior but appeared to have reduced, or standard as most were calling it, damage? Reading the comments from around this time, it was clear to see that most people still didn't fully understand the differences between standard and premium cars, and we were only a few months prior to the release of the game. And a big part of this confusion was that whenever Kaz or Polyphony or Sony had mentioned standard cars, they had never once shown an example. But at E3 in June, after yet more standard car confusion, we finally got a trailer showing the first ever footage of standard cars in GT5. Let's take a look. They were just PS2 ports all along. Well, that's what it seemed like. It wasn't until the Tokyo Game Show in September, in another interview with Kaz, that it was confirmed this was actually the case. In that same interview, Kaz also explained that the decision to feature these cars was as a result of wanting a large number and variety of cars in the game, but the highly detailed premium cars meant that it would have taken way too long to make them all at the same level of quality. 10 years is the estimate he gave in a previous statement. So, the standard car mystery had finally been solved, but what remained to be seen is how these standard cars would feature in the game, and whether there would be any more differences when compared to the premium models. Finally releasing in November 2010, Gran Turismo 5 was at long last in the hands of the players, who could experience these standard cars without Polyphony trying to hide them away in the corner. And needless to say, that wouldn't take long, given that your first car in GT5 would very likely be a standard car. GT5 had two dealerships, the normal dealership housing all of the PS3 quality premium models, and the used cars dealership, where you'll find the 830 or so standard cars at slightly discounted prices. Of course, the used car dealership had featured in the previous games, but using it in this way to separate the two grades of cars was an interesting decision. On one hand, it did keep the presentation of the cars consistent, although that would fall apart the moment you hit the track. But on the other, it led to some pretty weird situations. such as finding the Bugatti Veyron, one of the latest and greatest hypercars, in the used offerings, and then something like a Suzuki Cappuccino in the premium showroom. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. What also didn't make much sense was that the used dealers would only contain up to 30 cars at a time, of course refreshing over time as you did things in the game. Given that at any given point there would be 800 other cars waiting in the wings to appear in the used dealers, this meant that getting a specific car was extremely difficult. Even more so when you consider that half of them were Mazda Roadsters. Anyway, the side effect of this was that the lower quality standard cars were in some ways more desirable than their fully detailed brethren. Of course, most would prefer to drive the premium cars given their benefits: interior view, a proper damage model, more moving parts like high beam headlights and windscreen wipers, and more customization like aftermarket wheels and custom aero parts. But the difference was that a premium car could be bought at any time, provided you had enough credits and a high enough driver level. Your chances of finding a certain standard car whilst having the required credits and driver level were a lot slimmer, so when you did get a rare one, it was quite a big deal. A very notorious example is with the Formula GT World Championship. To compete in this event, you need a Formula GT car, unlike the versions in GT3 and GT4 where you could use whatever. GT5 also features a couple of real-life Ferrari Formula 1 cars, but they can't be used for any events, so you need the Formula GT. So this meant either getting extremely lucky and finding one in the used dealers whilst being at least level 24 and having roughly 5 million credits to spare, or completing the entire endurance series in either A spec or B spec and then having a 1 in 3 chance of winning it from the level 24 gift card ticket. Neither were really ideal for the player. And if you managed either of those and then won the championship spanning 6 20-lap races, your prize car was complete shit and you've wasted your time. Thanks GT5. So I mentioned that these standard cars were all ports from GT4, but this isn't entirely true. Some came from Gran Turismo on the PSP, which released in 2009. Many new and interesting cars ended up as standard models because of this, such as the aforementioned Veyron, as well as both Lamborghini Countaches, and the Audi R8 LMS. It seems like they ran out of time to make these cars into premium models, or they simply prioritized making other premium models given that they already had the lower quality PSP models of these cars to use. Another car which was subject to this was the Mazda Furai, a one-off rotary-powered concept which also appeared in GT PSP. However, the real car was destroyed in a fire whilst being tested for Top Gear magazine in 2008. So even if they had planned to make it a premium model for GT5, this was likely no longer possible. But there are a couple of standard cars which featured in neither GT4 nor GT PSP. First is the Mazda Axela 23S. To be honest, until I started researching for this video, I didn't actually realise this car wasn't in GT4 or PSP. Maybe it was planned to be in one of them but was eventually cut, who knows. The second of these cars is more interesting though. The Jaguar XFR appeared as a standard car in GT5 despite being a 2010 model year car. This means there was no chance of it being a cut car from GT4 or PSP finally appearing in GT5. It is truly unknown why this car was made as a lower quality model and missing an interior view when its inclusion in GT5 at all would suggest it must have been a premium model. In that sense, it's kind of anachronistic. Sticking with the standard car mysteries, we need to talk about the Subaru Impreza Rally Car 99. This car was seen in full premium form in footage for Gran Turismo HD, but much like the Zenavi Nismo Z GT500 and Impreza WRX Type RA road car, was never made playable in GT HD concept, and neither was it in GT5 Prologue, but the car did return for GT5. However, unlike the other two, the version of it we got was the ported over PS2 model as a standard car. So what happened to the much more detailed GT HD model of the car? Well again, nobody outside of Polyphony really knows. There are a few theories though, such as maybe the model was outsourced to another company to create, and then Polyphony somehow lost the license to use it. Or maybe they weren't happy with the model, given it was one of their earlier PS3 creations, so scrapped it and used the PS2 model instead to prevent creating a third category of semi-premium cars. Or maybe a clumsy dev just fat-fingered their keyboard and perma-deleted it on accident. It's unlikely that we'll ever know the full story. Anyway, a few more interesting notes on standard cars in GT5. Despite Polyphony's reluctance to show them off in trailers and gameplay, there is actually one standard car that can be found in the International Spec 1 intro of the game. It's a real blink and you'll miss it moment. Take a look. Did you catch it? Right there. That is unmistakably the Pescarolo C60 Hybrid Judd race car. Despite having GT4 logos, it actually debuted in GT PSP, but was first seen a couple of years prior to that in a screenshot for GT HD Classic, which was basically intended as an enhanced version of GT4. If you had GT PSP, you could transfer cars from your garage into GT5. Interestingly, if the car you were transferring had been made into a premium model in GT5, you would get a standard version of that car instead. I don't know why you would want to, but it's interesting to know. Unlike premium models, standard cars couldn't be used in photo travel in GT5. Presumably, they didn't want the crusty PS2 models mixing with their highly detailed 3D environments. Fortunately, the same idea doesn't apply to the tracks you race on. With GT5 being the first full Gran Turismo game with online connectivity, this meant that it was now possible for the game to receive updates. When it comes to standard cars, the first major update was just 1 month after launch in December 2010, where version 1.05 of the game brought the Online Collector's Dealership among other additions. The Online Collector's Dealership, or OCD, was like the used cars dealership, except the cars available were specifically curated by Polyphony and updated every 2 weeks. Effectively, it was a way to give players a better opportunity to find the rare and expensive standard cars. For example, the Formula GT was almost always a fixture there, which was surely a relief for many players at the time. On a few occasions, the OCD even stocked the GT PSP standard versions of certain cars, which could previously only be obtained by transferring data from a GT PSP save file, such as the Ferrari Enzo. Then, in October of 2011, the Spec 2.0 update of GT5 was released. A slew of changes were included in this update, such as many fan-requested alterations and additions, and one of those was related to the standard cars. Interior views were now included for all of the standard models. However, this doesn't mean that they had actually modelled all of the interiors, so in most cases they were just a black outline. However, a few of the open-top cars, such as the LMPs and previously mentioned Formula GT, did feature modelled interiors, albeit still at a lower detail than the full premium cars. Later, in Update 2.02, it was made possible to fit custom wheels to standard cars. Since this was doable in GT4, it didn't really make much sense to not allow them in GT5, but even still there were some limitations. For one, still none of the race cars could have custom wheels like they could in the previous games. Also, certain road cars couldn't either. The Bugatti Veyron was quite an infamous example. Before GT5 launched, Kaz had stated that some standard cars would gradually be upgraded to full premium models. It took until January of 2012 before that started to come to fruition. In the Car Pack 3 DLC, the Jaguar XJR9 was included as a full premium model. The standard model still existed in the game, however, so it wasn't a complete replacement. And within the life cycle of GT5, that was the only standard car to be upgraded to a premium model. We would have to wait until the release of Gran Turismo 6 for more of those. When GT6 came out in December of 2013, a few more cars had been upgraded to premium models. These included some very requested upgrades, like the Bugatti Veyron and Lamborghini Countachs, but many other requested cars sadly didn't make the cut, like the Mark IV Toyota Supra or E46 M3 for example. Including the completely brand new premium cars, there was a total of 445 premium models in GT6, way up on the roughly 200 that GT5 launched with. From this perspective, you could have argued this was already plenty of cars, but Polyphony didn't seem to agree, because the 800 or so remaining standard cars were still carried into GT6, meaning that when the game launched, there was a total of 1,240 cars. So, how were the standard cars handled in GT6? Well, the used dealership was no more. All of the cars in the game, whether premium or standard, were all available to purchase in one big dealership at all times. This changed the dynamic somewhat, since all of the cars were now on a level playing field, meaning that unless you really wanted a specific model, there was very little reason to not buy a premium car over a standard one. And further adding to this imbalance was that all of the prize cars in the base game were premium cars as well. In some ways, it kind of feels like the standard cars, which still made up the vast majority of the car list, were just an afterthought. Anyway, where GT5 had the clear standard and premium classifications, things got a little more complicated in GT6. The cars were now split between ones with simple interiors and those with detailed interiors. Now, that doesn't sound like a massive change, but it does make things a lot messier. For instance, the few standard cars which did have interiors, like the open-top LMPs, were classified under detailed while still looking like PS2 era models in most cases. And then a handful of other cars, most notably many of the Vision GT cars, were premium models for all intents and purposes, but as they lacked a detailed interior, they were listed as simple. In essence, this now created 4 categories of cars. Cars with simple interiors and simple exteriors, detailed interiors and simple exteriors, simple interiors and detailed exteriors, and both detailed interiors and exteriors. Yeah, way to overcomplicate things, Polyphony. For simplicity, I'll still refer to the cars with detailed exteriors as premium and simple exteriors as standard, regardless of their interiors, as determined by the gallery view in GT6, which only allows cars with detailed exteriors. So, standard cars didn't serve a huge purpose in the main game, but that's not to say that they didn't add any value to GT6. The sheer amount of cars available in GT6's dealership was staggering, and covered almost every facet of motoring history all in one place. Given how much time I've spent with GT6 and the series as a whole, I'm aware of pretty much every car in this game, but that's just me being a massive GT nerd. It's pretty much guaranteed that regardless of if you're a real car buff or have even sunk hundreds of hours into this game, if you turn on GT6 and spend some time browsing the dealership, you will find a car that you didn't realise was in this game or even knew existed at all. That was the magic of GT6. People have described Gran Turismo as like an interactive car encyclopedia, but GT6 is probably the only game where I feel like that's really true. You have a huge amount of cars that can be bought at any time providing you have the cash. No hoops to jump through like winning long championships and endurance races. The post-game of GT6 kind of feels like one big toy box, where you pick and choose which cars you want to mess around with today. I've always been clear that I prefer the Gran Turismos that are more thought out and well structured, like Gran Turismo 3, but I can definitely see the appeal of GT6 as well. It's the idea of turning on the game, diving into the dealership, and just seeing where it takes you. But if you do that, you might discover that some of these old standard cars don't look as bad as you may remember. Even just a few months after GT5 launched, some of the worst looking standard cars were given graphical improvements. I mean, they still didn't look good, but they were better. Initially, standard cars in GT5 actually looked worse than they did in GT4 and even GT3. Part of this was down to the increased resolution and clarity of the image, exposing more errors in the models. But also, some of the PS2 models did get a little bit distorted. Notice how the grille of this Alto cuts slightly over the Suzuki badge, which didn't happen in the previous games. But Polyphony's work here wasn't just limited to correcting previous errors, but also improving the standard models across the board. Over the course of GT5 and 6, many standard cars were given graphical improvements. These were things like more defined panels and panel gaps, higher quality textures for lights, liveries, badges and wheels, and better modelled paint that reflected light in a more realistic way. The cars from Roof are the best examples, wherein their upgraded models just look like premium cars without interiors. But there are plenty more. How many more? Try 150. These were unofficially dubbed as semi-premium cars, given how much better they looked than the mostly unchanged standard cars. Also, of these semi-premiums, the Mitsubishi FTO GP version R and Peugeot 106 S16 were the only two that could have unpainted carbon fibre hoods just like premium models, for some reason. Credit where credit is due here, because Polyphony never made a big song and dance over these improved models, they just gradually got better over time. Kaz did state in one interview prior to GT6's release that they were working on improving the standard models, but that was about it. I'll leave a link to the full list of semi-premium cars written up by Vag Gomez over on GT Planet in the description, as well as the GT5 to GT6 comparison images created by Mikhail K, and a video showcasing various improved standard cars in GT6 from Random Car Guy 17. So, what next for standard cars? As the support for GT6 wound down and attention turned to the next game in the series, one of the big questions was whether standard cars would feature in the next PS4 installment of the franchise. In June 2014, Kaz stated that he felt it was unlikely that they would do away with standard cars, given the diversity they offered and the popularity of many of these older vehicles. What form that would take though was anyone's guess. Would they carry over the PS3 premium models unchanged and call them standards? Or maybe the 150 or so semi-premium cars? Or would they really continue with the backlog of PS2 standards that date as far back as 2001? Well, in May of 2016, we got our answer. GT Sport had been revealed as the next title in the series the previous October, but in May, a reveal event for the game was hosted in London. The bottom line was that GT Sport would launch with just 130 cars. But 130 cars that were all especially modelled for the PS4, dubbed as super premium cars. And when GT Sport eventually released in October 2017, this was the case. So, standard cars were no more. Or were they? Now, although these 130 cars in the base game were all built from the ground up, according to Polyphony, would the same apply for the cars added later in updates? In a previous video, I used the premise that every car from GT Sport onwards has been designed from scratch as a basis for my arguments, given what Polyphony has said about their super premium models. But thinking about it now, I'm not 100% sure that this is true. And despite what Polyphony has said, I've always had this sneaking suspicion in the back of my mind. In one of GT Sport's first ever updates in December 2017, 12 new cars were added to the game, one of them being the Suzuki Swift. Without looking at the teaser too intently at the time, I just assumed this would be the then new 3rd generation Swift, or even the 2nd gen which had debuted in 2010. But no, it was the 1st gen, a 2007 model year. The exact same one which had been in GT5 and 6. This already made me slightly suspicious, as well as the fact that of the 12 cars in that update, 10 of them were identical model years and specs to the ones that had been premiums in GT6. And this trend seemed to continue with future updates as well. Still, this didn't confirm anything. Maybe they already had the reference images and laser scans for those models, so it was far easier to make a new model still based on those. But you can probably see what I'm implying here, that many of these so-called super premium cars are actually just polished up PS3 era premium models. Now, I'm not able to dive into the code of these games and extract the 3D models to find out if this is actually true, but the argument is compelling. I mean, you can compare them for yourself. They're practically identical. This also lines up with what Kaz had said whilst GT5 was still in development. Premium cars, however, are like a glimpse of the future of the GT series. Moreover, and we have mentioned before, we may have gone too far into detail on PS3. What we have done is perhaps more appropriate for a future console. So the idea is that the PS3 premium models were designed to such a high fidelity for the time, they were effectively future-proofed for the next console generation. But if this really was the case, then how come GT Sport only launched with 130 cars? There were 474 premium cars in GT6 by the end of its life, and yet even by the end of GT Sport's content update cycle, there was still only 338 cars. So make your own conclusions, I guess. Anyway, the term super premium is pretty meaningless anyway, given that it's the only classification of cars in GT Sport and GT7. It's pretty much just a way for them to show off. The history of standard versus premium cars was rather convoluted and confusing, even before GT5 released. But we now have to ask the big question: was this all worth it? Many people hated seeing the blocky standard cars in their PS3 game, but others loved the fact that all of their old favourites from GT3 and 4 were still in the game. So was it the right decision? To determine that, I think we need to talk about what the impact of not having standard cars would have been. In discussions around standard cars, people will always talk about how they look, that they're outdated, an eyesore, they're not consistent with the premium cars, but something that rarely ever gets mentioned is what GT5 would have been like without standard cars. There were just over 200 premium cars in GT5. I mean, GT3 only had 180 cars total, so that's not a massive deal breaker, right? Well, I feel the situation is a bit different. Despite only having 180 cars, GT3 has a very solid variety. With the exception of not having much pre-1980, you can find a bit of everything really. GT5 is a little bit more limited. Given these were intended for the premium dealership, the majority of the cars here are the cream of the crop, the really interesting and exciting stuff. There aren't too many commuters or mundane models, but that does miss a part of what Gran Turismo has always been about, starting from nothing and building your way up. If these were the only cars in the game, I feel like that element would have been lacking. It would in some ways feel like a recent Forza Horizon game. Although, had they known there would be no standard cars from the start, they could have prioritised different cars to model and make that balance closer to what we normally expect in a Gran Turismo game. So really, I think the bigger issue would have been perception. The fact that after waiting 6 years since the previous title, with numerous delays building expectations, for the game to launch with just 200 cars would have been severely underwhelming. GT3 launched not even 2 years after GT2, and less than a year after the PS2 itself had even debuted in most regions. Whatever backlash they got from including standard cars in GT5, I don't think could have been much worse than the backlash they would have got without them. And the benefits were that they had way more cars to build the game around, and thus make it a more fleshed out experience, and they got to parade around the over 1,000 cars tagline in their marketing. And boy did they do that. To be honest, I'd be really fascinated if someone made a modded version of GT5 which removed all of the standard cars and then restructured the game, including all of the events, around the 200 cars that were left. I think that would be a really interesting experiment. So yeah, when it comes to GT5, I personally think that standard cars were a good decision. Of course, they could have handled them better, like being a lot more transparent about them pre-release, but overall, I believe it was for the best. Just a quick note, although standard cars got all the attention back in the day, standard tracks were also a thing. Yes, although they were never officially labelled, there were a handful of circuits which were carried over from GT4 with minor alterations. These were mostly original circuits like Grand Valley Speedway, Trial Mountain, and Deep Forest. There weren't many of them, so it was pretty subtle, and honestly, they didn't really need to be changed a whole lot anyway. Just being in the new game engine with different lighting made them feel fresh. When we look at the standard cars in GT6, this is where my feelings get more mixed. It wasn't necessarily a given that they would even return. The 445 premium cars that GT6 launched with would have been perfectly fine on their own, and if they had added a few more much requested cars in updates, that would have been excellent. And yet they still decided to have the PS2 models tag along in GT6, where due to how the game was structured, they served very little purpose. It's an odd one. Was it simply the case that they had paid for the licenses for these cars to a certain date, and so still felt obliged to use them? Or were they just over-obsessed with having as many cars as physically possible? Either way, I don't hate the decision. As I've said, there is a lot of fun to be had just exploring and messing around with some of the more obscure and forgotten cars. But it does make me wonder what GT6 could have been if they had scaled back and made the game a more focused experience. In the sense of using their time to make GT6 the game that GT5 should have been all along. It's well known by now just how many difficulties developers working with the PS3 faced back in the day. This quote from Kaz himself pretty much sums it up. The PS3 hardware is something that, at first glance, looks like it's able to do this certain level of thing, but in actuality, it can't. Sadly, these issues whilst developing GT5 carry through the entire PS3 generation, and some would argue that they still have a lasting legacy on the franchise to this very day. Unfortunately, the standard cars are just emblematic of those problems. So what if some of the car models in GT7 date all the way back to 2010 or even earlier? If nobody notices and it doesn't affect their functionality, then why should it matter? The case for Forza though is quite different. People do notice, and they've noticed for a while now. It isn't exactly subtle. The problem Forza has had is that it's never undergone a generational reset like Gran Turismo has many times. But at the same time, they've never been upfront about the situation, like Polyphony were with the standard cars. They just continue to polish the old models and hope people won't pull them up on it. It would be like if Gran Turismo added modelled interiors into the semi-premium cars from GT6 and continued using them in GT Sport onwards without saying anything. In theory, we could have been playing GT7 with car models dating as far back as GT3. But with the latest Motorsport reboot, this is particularly egregious, given just how many times we've been assured that the game has been built from the ground up. So when it becomes apparent that it hasn't been in many areas, and not just the car models by the way, Forza Wing,
built from the ground up,
it isn't too surprising that people would then use this phrase to beat them back over the head with. People don't like it when you reuse almost 2 decades old assets, but they like it even less when you try to pull the wool over their eyes. So that's what I think about Gran Turismo's standard cars versus Forza's current predicament, the comparison which nobody asked for but I made anyway. Well, join me again in a couple of weeks when I upload my next video, in 240p for seemingly no reason, and ignore everyone when they complain about it. Have a good one.